3 o'clock here in Brussels. And as I said, good morning to our members joining from the United States and Canada. And happy belated Canada Day to those Canadians who joined. I'm going to make a few Kudo technical announcements now before we start the meeting in a couple minutes, if that's all right. Paul? As you'll note, Paul, who is your normal director of the Economics and Security Committee, will be doing a lot of the behind-the-scenes work with the rapporteur and with the chairman of the committee. I'm helping assist him to make sure this runs smoothly. My name is Ethan Corbin. I'm the director of the Defense and Security Committee, if I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you. Just a couple important announcements I'd like to make. You can choose your preferred language from the drop-down menu at the bottom left of your screen. It'll say floor, and I believe you can then choose to Italian, French, or English. In addition, please note that still images will probably be taken during this meeting to use for our social media channels as well as our press release. I would also like to note to members that this meeting is recorded for internal distribution to delegations and or publication on the NATO PA website and as well as our YouTube channel. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A session, please click on the Request to Speak button, which is at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. This will make your name appear on our president and our chair's screen, and then he will call on you, and the NATO PA staff will help bring you up to video and audio, at which point you can make your comments and or pose your question. Again, as I said, headset is strongly recommended. It's very helpful for our interpreters. And I would also like to note that if you do pose a question and you are not speaking in English, please let us know. That gives us a minute to make the proper adjustments with the interpreters, etc., to accommodate for that, and allows our other members who might not understand your language to switch to interpretation. If you have any problems during this meeting, please refresh your page. This is likely to take care of 95% of any problems you have. This will allow you to help any audio or video problems you may have. If this does not work, leave the meeting and then re-enter it again. Okay? And again, finally, right before we start, since it's now 3 o'clock, I'd like to stress that this meeting is conducted under Chatham House rule. This means that you are welcome to use the information provided by our speakers, but no comment should be attributed to them. To repeat, please do not identify either explicitly or implicitly who said what during today's webinar, and this allows us, of course, as always, for more open and frank discussions. And also, it's public, it's going up, so it's not Chatham. I've been corrected, I apologize. It is not Chatham House. You may do whatever you like with the information that we have at this point. Everyone is aware of this. Excuse my error. And final mentioning, I would like to make clear to everyone that at the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a tab that says Documents. Should note that the reports being discussed today, as well as the agenda, can be found there. Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to turn over the floor to our chairman, Ivan Sklemenčius.
Thank you, Ethan, for your explanation how we need to work in here during the 2 hours. I think we tried many different systems for the last 3 years, because before we did not just that systems it's working. Okay, return back in our Economic and Security Committee virtual committee meeting. Dear colleagues, welcome to the first ever virtual meeting of the Economics and Security Committee. Today, we will consider 2 of our committees for reports. I am sorry that the circumstances make this necessary, but I am delighted nevertheless that we can meet to deliberate on our reports. I would like to call the committee to order and declare the committee meeting open. I would also like to greet all members of the Economics and Security Committee, as well as associated members, and express my gratitude to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly Secretariat for adjusting to these difficult circumstances and making it possible for us to meet online today. Please note that we will also be meeting in September to consider the two draft reports of our subcommittee, Rapporteur Austrine Armonaite and Jean-Marie Bockel. Our aim remains to consider the final version of all of our report at the Athens annual session. Some practical information for everybody. The two draft committee report by our General Rapporteur Christian Tybring-Gledde that we will discuss today, as well as the draft agenda, have been sent to you. You can also find the document on this Kudo page on the right side of your screen. Today is very tightly scheduled, and we will do our very best to keep this meeting under 2 hours. So we will have exercise control on our debates to keep us on time. I will therefore structure the meeting in the following way. I will ask that our rapporteur present his first report. We will then collect all the comments and he will respond to them all together. We will follow the same procedures for the second report. I would also appeal to any members of a delegation that have specific comments or suggestions to be sure to send this by mail to Paul Cook, the committee director, if you haven't already done so prior to the meeting. This will be very helpful when the report is redrafted for the second reading of the reports at the fall session in Athens. I would now ask that the committee take up the draft agenda for this proceeding. Are there any comments? No comments? Thank you. It is adopted. Now, we will be looking consideration of the draft general report on China Belt and Road Initiative, a strategic and economic assessment by Christian Tybring-Gledde. General Rapporteur. Christian, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Ivans. I hope everybody can hear me. Dear colleagues, in 2013, China announced perhaps the most ambitious investment and infrastructure program ever conceived. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has come to be understood as a perfect expression of China's global economic, diplomatic, and strategic ambitions. This draft report argues that this grand project will shape the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century in ways that the transatlantic community cannot ignore. Chinese officials list a set of benign goals for the project, fostering greater regional connectivity, enhancing trade, investment, and economic prosperity, deepening political trust, and maintaining closer economic ties among nations. Western policymakers and analysts, however, have ascribed many other drivers to the project. These are more aligned with national security policy and China's ambitions to achieve global superpower status. While China is a strategic rival to the West, it is also an important commercial partner and a key link in global value chains. The report suggests that China cannot easily be isolated from the world economy. To attempt to do so would inflict very high cost on the West. Instead, we need to work collectively, reduce the threats China poses, and exploit the opportunities it affords. That will not be easy undertaking, and new balances will have to be struck. In practical terms, the BRI can be understood as three interlinked initiatives: the Silk Road Economic Belt, the Maritime Silk Road, and more recently, the Digital Silk Road. The Silk Road Economic Belt and Maritime Silk Road seek to enhance China's links with East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Africa, and Europe through 6 economic corridors. However, China's ambitions...
Excuse me, Christian, can you read a little bit slowly? Thank you.
Yep,
Little slowly. Thank you.
However, China's ambitions is not limited to building physical infrastructure projects. Beijing also seeks to use the BRI to align partner nations with its regulatory and overall international vision. Along these corridors, a broad array of infrastructure projects are underway, including oil pipelines, roads, railways, ports, and digital networks, as well as a host of industrial investments. Beijing also sees the digital Silk Road as a vehicle for achieving a dominant position in a number of cutting-edge sectors. The debate over the future structure of 5G networks and the role of Chinese industry in building that infrastructure is very much related to this project. China also intends to set up at least 50 special economic development zones within the borders of some countries participating in the BRI. These zones would be governed by special commercial and trading rules that collectively aim to facilitate investments and deepen China's trading ties with these regions. The report also discusses an Arctic dimension to this wide-ranging undertaking. The draft report next explores the specific risk the project poses to the West. These include allegations that the BRI funds and builds infrastructure that could be used to facilitate China's military expansion. It creates debt traps through opaque lending practices. It pays scant attention to environmental sustainability. It opens opportunities for espionage, particularly through the digital Silk Road. It engages in questionable labor practices, and it turns a blind eye to corruption, and therefore weakens international efforts to improve good governance, not only in developing countries, but also in our own. There are related concerns that China is pursuing a divide and conquer strategy in Europe through the BRI. Although the European Union has started to take a more critical stance towards Chinese investments, member states are divided on the right approach towards the BRI. In fact, a number of EU and NATO member countries have already signed on to some elements of the BRI. To engage directly with a range of Central and Eastern European states, China has launched the so-called 17+1 framework, which notably excludes the EU. The report notes that the Western Balkans has emerged as a major area of interest for China. Beijing sees the region as an entry point into European markets and welcomes the fact that at least part of the region operates outside the EU regulation. Beijing's financial engagement in these regions will invariably increase its diplomatic clout. Countries hoping to receive substantial investment, for example, could be tempted to align more closely with China on matters like 5G, or even face pressure to ignore Chinese human rights violations. There are also risks of transatlantic tension here, as the United States government is deeply suspicious of the BRI and sees it more in a geostrategic than in economic terms. Indeed, the U.S. national security strategy identifies China as a strategic competitor and characterizes the BRI as a challenge to U.S. interests, particularly as it aims to give China a strategic foothold in Europe and Asia by expanding its unfair trade practices and investing in key industries, sensitive technologies, and infrastructure. U.S. officials and analysts also argue that the BRI has become the primary vehicle for China to extend its influence beyond the Asia-Pacific and to increase its leverage in Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Africa. For its part, the U.S. military is deeply concerned that much of the infrastructure that the BRI promises to build has both commercial as well as military applications. Washington thus sees China primarily as a rising power aiming to challenge its global position whereas to many in Europe, China offers commercial opportunities while also posing competitive threats. Allied countries will accordingly need to agree on a common approach toward China so that it does not become a fault line within NATO itself. Dialogue on China is thus essential. It is no coincidence that 3 NATO PA committees this year have reports on China. We all need to do our part to think through this critical challenge. The BRI also has implications for Russia and for the Arctic. Indeed, China sees itself as a near-Arctic state, although this is a concept bereft of legal significance. It is suggestive of China's ambitions. Beijing hopes to exploit new and shorter shipping routes made possible by receding Arctic ice, as well as the region's abundant natural resources that are becoming increasingly accessible. China has linked these ambitions to its support for Arctic science and its active participation in various Arctic fora, including the Arctic Council, where it enjoys permanent observer status. But it is also working to strengthen bilateral ties with Arctic states and has established the Polar Silk Road program for these purposes. Beijing has begun to make strategic investments in the far north and has even sought to purchase a former U.S. naval base that could host naval ships and submarines. Russia has become one of the largest recipients of Chinese BRI investment, reflecting the degree to which China sees Russia as a strategic partner. China's enormous demand for energy and Russia's large reserves of carbon energy make them, at least in this area, natural partners. Some Western strategists worry that China and Russia might join forces in the Arctic, which would pose a serious challenge to littoral countries and to NATO itself. At the same time, however, Russia might be reluctant to give up influence to China in what it regards as its own backyard. Finally, the draft report, written as the coronavirus pandemic was just beginning, knows that this crisis could well alter the dynamics of relations with China, although it is very difficult to predict how at this moment. Clearly, the U.S. administration has been very focused on China's lack of transparency in the early stages of the pandemic. A number of European governments share this concern, but how this concern is expressed differs in important ways. The draft report concludes by urging Europe and North America to develop a shared approach to the BRI that both recognizes China's geostrategic ambitions and respond to those that threaten international security, but also acknowledges the economic rationale for continued engagement with China. There should be no doubt that elements of the BRI and China's related foreign policies do indeed threaten Western interests and values. Nevertheless, this does not mean that all of China's economic ambitions are illegitimate and threatening. Framing China's rise as a simple zero-sum game in which anything that benefits China hurts the West is likely to be counterproductive and can increase rather than reduce global tensions. The report accordingly calls for the transatlantic community to hold out for another model of development and investment based on the principle of transparency, sustainability, liberal markets principles, including free trade, and good governance. We should all work to promote these values and to encourage China to embrace them as well. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Okay,
that was an...
Ethan?
Sorry. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to let you know that if members are looking to take the floor, please hit the request to speak button at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll bring you up to address this very pertinent and relevant topic for today.
Okay, we're waiting the question from our assembly member, but I would like to ask the question for Christian. First of all, the questions about what the Norwegian thinking about the Chinese ambition about the Arctic way. And also, second question from myself, also in the paragraph number 3 point maybe 40 about maybe that we're talking about the European responses to the brief. But you know, this a huge project in European Union between the 3 Baltic countries to build a special railway from Tallinn to connect with Warsaw, and perhaps it will be maybe in 2026 maybe ready. It also play a role in military role also. It will be also like answer to China brief, but I cannot to find something. Maybe we need to complain also to the September to put this point and give information about the Baltic, because there was also connection Tallinn with the Helsinki by underground, also to build a special tunnel under the Baltic Sea. But now the government in Finland is changing, and maybe they stopped this project, but maybe after 5 years it will be beginning again, return back. How do you think about these two questions? Thank you.
Should we?
Mr. Chairman, I have one more request. Would you like to bundle them or take this first couple questions?
Well, yes, I can do my best to answer those questions. I think it's very difficult for me to be the spokesman of the Norwegian government right now, but I know that there are challenges in the Arctic for Norway. Like in the polar area, both with the Chinese present there, and it's a new thing for Norway. When you talk about the general relationship for Norway with China, we are trying to make trade agreements with China, but we get all the same issues that you all are getting when you talk about with China, except for the U.S., who has more of a bigger issues to address, as it says in the paper, that they have a bigger issue with regard to the strategic interest of being the global world power militarily and also trade-wise. So there's a difficulty being looking at the trade advantages and the economic advantages with close trade with China, and the military consequences of being too close to China. And also, as China has all these different benefits from not competing on the same level as European nations, NATO nations do. They have not the same with the labor consequences, not with the environment, and all of the concerns that means that it's easier for them to be competitive than to be European nations. But on one hand, it's better that we are actually getting economic advantages and economic growth through trade with China. But it's also very difficult to compete with China, not just because they're an enormous population, but also because they have different sets of rules or principle of doing economic trade. So it's very difficult. And for, as you're saying, for the EU, even though EU is a bigger mass, and in that sense, I think it's to be a member of the EU is better in that sense, that you are more people and you're stronger than for a small nation like Norway, who also has Russia as a neighbor. So this is my general answer to, and then to be specific about your questions. It's very difficult for me to be an overruled and a judge on the issues that you're raising. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Christian. We have
Mr. Chairman, I have Harriet Baldwin from the United Kingdom who would like to take the floor. I'll bring her up.
We didn't hear you, Harriet. We didn't hear you. Not yet. Please on your microphone.
You may need to switch on your microphone in the lower part of the screen where it says mic off on. You just click on that, and that should help you get on. It's switched off right now. Now it should work.
Yeah.
Another suggestion, if I may, is that in the
Yeah.
settings, you can see the settings cog, Ms. Baldwin, and then if you go to the settings cog, and you can check out the system settings and make sure your headset is in fact enabled for both microphone and speaker. Okay. I currently do not have another request for the floor. Hopefully, Ms. Baldwin from the United Kingdom will be able to resolve her issues soon, and we can hear her question. I do have one now. Mr. Douglas Chapman would like to take the floor. Mr. Chairman, we'll bring him up.
Thank you very much, and Commissioner, thanks very much for the clear way in which you've delivered your report. Can I ask if there are any particular concerns in terms of projects that are currently underway between that axis that you suggested between China and Russia that is of immediate concern to NATO? We all know that China are on a very long path. They don't expect results immediately. They take a very, very extensively long view of their approach to things. But I just wondered if there was any immediate concerns that you managed to highlight in your investigation, and also what kind of discussions do you think NATO should be having with the Arctic Circle countries who are maybe perhaps more sceptical about the Belt and Road approach?
Thank you. Should I respond?
Yes, please.
I think we as a NATO countries, we have to be very careful in where we step and how far we step here, because if we are too restricted, too negative to China's growth and China's economic power, it will also scare them, or not scare them. That's not the right word. It will bring them possibly closer to Russia, just because Russia has a huge storage of natural resources, and China has a huge need of the same energy sources that Russia has. So I think the close relationship is something that will develop even closer. It makes sense, but as long as NATO and our 30 nations play a relevant part, it means that we have to be close connected to China, and also be close connected to Russia at the same time. And this is a very tough way of doing business, because you have the military on one side and you have the trade on the other side. But as long as we have few reason to think of China as a military opponent to or threat to NATO, I think it makes sense that we are closing the relationship with China. But I would like to reiterate that the United States has a little different, will have a different view on China, just because of their size and their historic size of their economy, and being the world leading, just economy leading nation, meaning that they have a little different approach towards China. And it means, but for a small nation, for example, like Norway and other nations within NATO, it's do or die relationship with China, actually. And as more we are actually trying to freeze China out from our markets, and the other way around, it will force Russia into the hands of Russia, with China into the hands of Russia, and it could make them a really great power together, which is even more dangerous for NATO as an alliance. So this is my my answer, and I know it could be probably much more, let's say, deeper and more reflecting, but I think anyway, I think it's important that we have a close relationship to China, and that we think of these issues separately, that we don't think militarily wise on all these issues, because they are not military issues, but they can combine be military issues if we are actually not cooperating with China. So again, we need to be close to China at the same time having a certain distance and not forcing them in the hands of Russia.
Thank you, Christian.
Mr.
Just
Chairman.
another question.
Yes, I have.
John Speller.
I have John Speller, correct, from the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
It will be followed by Mr. Larson from the United States.
Fine. Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Because I had great difficulties in getting onto the system, so I apologize to being slightly late to it. Can I first comment on relations between China and Russia? There's an interesting story in today's New York Times about the United States recently presenting to Russia a lot of material regarding the rapid expansion of China's nuclear program and the question as to what that means for Russia as well as what it means for Asia, the rest of Asia, and for the United States. And then mention was made of the resources that Russia has. Much of that is in Siberia and in the east. But in many of those areas, my understanding is that the population is possibly now majority Han Chinese in those areas. Many are coming across and trading and working, and it is changing the demographic of those areas. That may not be a problem now, but it could be a significant issue further down the line. Now, that doesn't mean, as far as I can see, that we should then move into a position of open antagonism to China. As an ASEAN foreign minister said to me some time ago, when I posed some questions about China, his response was enigmatic, but also quite insightful. He said to me, China is a fact, and we have to deal with that in both ways. Both in terms of being realistic about China, about its internal system, about the repression, and also much more recently about external aggression and the impact that is having, particularly on its neighbours, and the reconfiguration of defence and security relationships there. But also, I think, how we, and this is particularly relates to the EU and NATO, is how we view Russia and how it works in international institutions. Because it has seemed that China has been following a twin-track policy with regard to that, in some cases undermining the institutions, and in other cases basically trying to take them over. And I won't go into the details of the relationship at the World Health Organization. But if, for example, we look at the World Trade Organization, we in the West did not have, and I'd like your view on this, as far as I can see, we did not have a coherent policy. We let China into the World Trade Organization. We expressed aspirations, as you did, that they would behave, but clearly they have regularly been in breach to their advantage of their obligations under the WTO, which has enabled them to spread their economic reach into other countries and has very much inhibited the engagement on any reasonable terms of other countries' businesses into China. And so I think we have to therefore develop a common policy on that. I'm not saying it should be containment, but the question is whether that should, that's got to be based on, if we are going to admit China into these bodies, that we actually have to be effective in insisting that they follow the same rules, otherwise they should stay out. Final point, which you touch on in your paper in a number of places, as to the extent at which we pull together, rather in the way that with the Soviets, when many were seeing them as all conquering, when in fact it was an extremely fragile society and economy, that China may not be as omnipotent as they try and present, with massive internal debt problems, considerable unrest, which they have to use massive repression, as we're seeing again in Hong Kong, huge environmental problems, and a demographic problem. And I think maybe through NATO, we need to be analysing not just the strengths in the external relations, but the internal tensions and issues that China is facing as well, and again, how we deal with that. I'd welcome your observations.
Thank you very much, John, for your questions. Please, Christian, answer.
Thank you very much. It's thank you for interesting thoughts there. And just let me assure you that for the this is just a draft report. For the final report or the next second report, that will make a bigger issue on the Russia-Chinese relationship. It will make a bigger part of the paper. I see the questions are running in that direction, and it makes sense that we are actually digging into that a little more carefully. Russia has challenges internally, and they have challenges externally. And I mean, China has, but we know exactly how that's going to be for Norway, being now a member of the UN Security Council. We know exactly what kind of difficulties, decisions we will have to make on different issues internally for China with the Uyghurians, and also what they do internally. It's very difficult to be a part of these decisions right now. For NATO as a whole, I see that there are two ways of doing this. We have, I think China can be a bigger, or could be a threat to NATO, our 30 nations, if we are actually excluding them from the good company, or let's say excluding them from being a part of our trade and the world economic trade, because it's they have a huge military power, and we don't know how they're going to react if they are excluded, or if the poverty will increase in China because they're not able to do trade with the West. It's very difficult. And when you get back to the what China has done with regards to the COVID-19, we get back to that in the report and the WHO, and actually buying up parts of companies in Europe, also in Norway. I know that this information is more confidential. It should not be discussed openly like we do now. So I think it will be just leave that where it is. And I think, first of all, we have other people to do these kind of investigations in all our nations, and not having on discuss this openly like we do now. But again, I think it's my main conclusion is that we need to have open trade with China as much as possible. At the same time, try to talk to China about the issues that are important to us, everything from environmental issues, labor issues, and all the issues that they really don't care about. And that's one of the reasons that they produce cheaper and better than many European nations. And also that they're expanding into our territory and our markets just by buying up our businesses somewhere. It's a tough challenge. But again, if you don't accept the trade as we have accepted our own trade for generations, we could force them over towards Russia. But as you was pointing out, there are challenges within China, both with regard to population growth and the demographics, and also where the people are actually living and where are the Russian resources located. So I see your challenges, but I don't have all the answers. I have all the questions as you do, and and I think the next report or the new draft report will have more on these issues, so we have more explained because the questions are going in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for your explanation. Next question will be from Rick Larsen from United States, who organized our visit NATO Parliamentary Assembly, the Economic Committee, to visit the Seattle just in June last year. Rick, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. How's the sound? Great.
Very good.
So, yeah, good. So I do want to start off by reporting that yesterday here in Washington, D.C., the Defense Committee of the House of Representatives met all day in session to develop the Pentagon budget. And it continues to have strong support for NATO and its missions. And that we will have a debate on the floor of the House in a couple of weeks. But the bill that left our committee late last night continues to show strong support for NATO and for its missions. And I want to just assure everyone of that. There's good, strong bipartisan support here in the United States for NATO. Christian, it's good to see you, and I've very much enjoyed your report. I spend quite a bit of time thinking about U.S.-China relationships, and I always say there's not one relationship between the United States and China. There are many relationships between the United States and China. Climate change, on counterterrorism, on the economics, of course, the strategic issues are important too. I want to just focus on paragraph 80, and maybe in your final report you can expand on this, but it has to do with the any effort to counter the worst elements of China's infrastructure programs will require significant capital injections. One of the debates around countering the BRI gets to whether or not the U.S., Europe, and Japan should address this collectively, or if each of the economic regions develop their own set of tools and create essentially three different competitors, if you will, to the BRI. And I'm wondering if you are thinking about addressing that, or if by November, if that's a lot to ask, because I think it would be a lot to ask. And I will say this: I hope we get our COVID-19 house in order, and we can show the Europeans that we are, so that if Athens takes place, that we'll be allowed to travel to Greece this November. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Christian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick. Please, Christian, do you want to comment?
I can comment. Just would like to thank Larson for the NATO support from the Congress and the bipartisan support. It's very, very important for our rest of the NATO countries to know that you have the U.S. support. Let's say it this way, that NATO is almost nothing without the U.S. So it's very important that you are part of this fully, as you are stating. You said that the U.S. is dealing with China on several levels, so that's what it makes so difficult, because you are in the West. We have certain values that we agree on. What trade is based on, how we treat each other, and how we treat our families, and how we treat everything. We have these are the values that we are actually been dominating the world for the last 150, 200 years, and now we are challenged not just by trade, but also the ways trade is being done. And that means that you have other ways of looking at it. You have some groups in the U.S. and some groups in Europe are saying that we cannot do trade with China because they are not treating the workers in the right way. They are not thinking about the environmental issues the same way as we do. So we cannot trade with them. Another group of people will say that we need to have trade with China because you have growth, and economic growth is very important. But what we should consider as NATO nations is how it means security-wise and militarily. And it's also important, as you were mentioning, that the nuclear development and advancement of China is very, let's say it's directly, it's threatening. It's security-wise, it's very dangerous for NATO to ignore it, and it's very, very difficult to do something about it. And if you are forcing China to say that you will stop investment, stop doing business with China, as I know that the United States have done on some certain issues, and I can understand that. But if you expand this to include more areas than just computers and internet and those kinds of issues, it can be very, very difficult and very dangerous for Europe, more for Europe than for the United States, both in regards to distance, but also in regards to size of economy. So I think we need to be very careful with what we do with China, and we just have to accept that China is now a part of the world, a part of the world trade, and they would like to be a part of, let's say, the economic relationship of the world. They are not isolated as they were earlier, and we just have to be careful that we are actually protecting our own industry, our own values, our own property, not at least our property, intellectual property. But again, we need to take advantage of their markets and the way of doing business. So it's, I know that Norway is trying to now to make a new trade agreement with China, and of course it's a challenge in all the ways, especially since you're also now a member of the UN Security Council, and how that's going to work, I don't know. It's a tough decisions, and to have a substitute, let's say, trade route than the BRI, or to replace it somehow. I don't know that's going to work out, but I can promise you, Larsen, that we will get back to these issues in the new report, and that will be. We understand that now that we have only a few lines on this U.S.-China, no, the China-Russia relations, but I think we will expand on that a lot, so we get better explanations for you next time.
Thank you, Christian. I think the Paul have the question. Yeah. No.
Mr. Chairman, we had some earlier technical challenges with Ms. Baldwin from the United Kingdom delegation, but she has written in a question. I will read it for you if that's okay. First, Mr. Rapporteur, she notes that she thinks it's an excellent report, and she has two short questions for you. First one, she wants to know, would it be possible for you to elaborate more on the digital element of the BRI, often known as the Digital Silk Road? The second question she would like to ask is to have some more information about naval activity, Chinese naval activity in the Atlantic Ocean, particularly when it comes to submarine activity. As you know, there have been some increased exercising and patrolling by the Chinese in that area. Thank you very much.
Please, Christian.
Thank you. I think I touched upon that when I answered the Mr. Larsen's questions. I think the 5G issues and that the United States has now excluded some of the Chinese, let's say, data equipment. I don't know this in the digital road that you were talking about. I think it's understood in China. I haven't seen any responses to that, but I think in the long run, they can develop the future system that could actually beat our system. So you don't know that, and if they do, it's we will lose in our way of protecting our markets if you think we win in the short term. So hopefully we are doing the right thing, but I think that it's also possible that we are not doing the right thing and just doing the absolute opposite of what we should do. More inclusion and less fighting to stay out of the market. Maybe it's impossible to do that in the short term. Yes, it's possible, and it's a good thing for the West. But in the long term, it may be we will beat ourselves too badly. Damn if you do, and damn if you don't, I guess. About the submarine activities, I cannot. I will not try to answer your question, and I should be more informed and better prepared for that, and I just have to not trying to answer something I don't know anything about, or very little about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christian. But I think we also can to do maybe a little bit more wide some paragraphs about these questions, what the people ask. And also the same with the same questions working also our Defense Committee also and Science Technology Committee also, but also we can to maybe repeat or complain this report also about this, because this will be our view from security point. Yes. Thank you very much. I don't have any more questions. Is it maybe somebody sent some inscription or no? Ethan?
Mr. Chairman, no? I currently do not have any additional requests for the floor or questions. No, sir.
So I can say, Christian, thank you very much for this first report. And we can to adapt this report. No, but we can take this your reports, and will be put some changing complaint for the next session in Athens. Now, I would like to ask Christian Tybring-Gledde to present the draft special report on the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Please, Christian, the floor is against you.
Thank you very much, Evans. This This report was not actually being planned, but it will be really strange to have a report on China's relationship with NATO if you don't talk about COVID-19 in these days. So it's the idea was to have it as a part of the first report, but now there is a separate report because you don't really know where this is going to end. So, colleagues, the global community is undergoing the most consequential pandemic since the Spanish influenza in 1918 and 19. This infectious virus has put a sudden stop to entire categories of human and economic activity. We are undergoing the most significant economic recession since the Great Depression. As the OECD has warned, if infection rates rise again this autumn, the consequences could be very severe and long-lasting. The EC special report suggests that the pandemic act as negative exogenous economic shocks. These shocks can profoundly affect supply-demand, monetary and fiscal conditions. They can induce dramatic contractions in output, investment, spending, employment, and trade. A pandemic will drive an immediate flight from risk and trigger a market-wide search for safe assets, otherwise known as a flight to quality, a phenomenon that results in capital flight from developing countries. The share of population infected, the number of work weeks lost, and the morbidity rate can determine the depth of the crisis. Measures undertaken to minimize the impact of the pandemic can also undermine the economy, at least over the short term. Lockdowns by time lower pressure on healthcare facilities and workers and reduce rates of infection. But they can also shut down national economies, at the same time failing to generate social consensus around government measures to combat a pandemic can increase the duration of the medical crisis and even unleash political unrest. Pandemic also have a very negative impact on trade, particularly once governments essentially shut down commercial activities and close borders. We know that trade remains a central engine for economic growth, development and innovation. Its collapse breaks up supply chains and undermines growth. This report accordingly states clearly that protectionism offers no solutions to the pandemic challenge. The collapse of consumer spending also exacerbates the recessionary effects of pandemics. Consumers refrain from more discretionary types of spending on items like clothing and tourism, while business activity plunges. The impact of financial market is also significant. Financial markets are even more vulnerable today than they were prior to the 2008 crisis. Both periods were characterized by an inordinate amount of debt. In 2008, that debt was held by financial institutions. In the current crisis, much of the debt is held by businesses and governments. There is a growing risk of a vicious cycle in which economic activity falls precipitously. Then this reduces business income, defaults rise, credit downgrades occur. Investors and funds dump debt on the market, credit becomes more expensive, and this in turn feeds into further defaults. Central banks can counter this by keeping interest rates low and by offering collateralized lending to the financial system while engaging in short-term lending on companies. Most Western governments are also providing critical support for cash-starved businesses and consumers. The risk here is that this will worsen government balance sheets and lead to a moral hazard problem by which firms come to assume that there is always an investor of last resort. In this case, the government to bail them out. But this risk is now outweighed by the systemic threat posed by a potential spiral to depression. The report explores how significant sectors were initially struck by the pandemic. The travel and tourist sectors, for example, were among the first victims of a pandemic-induced crisis. We know that their airline industry is cash dependent. The economic consequences of grounding air fleets have, therefore, hit that sector very hard, and this spilled over to airline manufacturers and many supplier companies. The automobile sector has been similarly impacted and is beset not only with falling demand, but also a serious disruption in supply chains and plant shutdowns in Europe and North America. Falling demand, lockdowns, collapsing the trade, and a Russian-Saudi price war have also hit the energy sector. Collapsing oil prices have particularly hurt North American shale producers, whose break-even prices are significantly higher than those of Gulf and Russian producers. Prices there are significantly lower than North American break-even prices. The report looks at short-term employment and income support programs by keeping workers at least nominally employed and paid. Even at reduced rates, firms will better positioned to recover quickly as the crisis winds down. Such measures also help sustain consumer demands and preserve social cohesion at a moment of serious public health and economic crisis. The report makes a strong plea for deeper international collaboration. No country can resolve either the medical or economic crisis on its own. Deepening international collaboration is not an objective driven by some internationalist idealism, but rather by a clear understanding of how best to defend national interest in a globally integrated economic order. Existing international institutions like the IMF, the OECD, and the World Bank all have essential roles to play here. The report, however, notes that European solidarity could be among the victims of this unprecedented economic collapse. There are signs of emerging north, south, and east-west tensions that an era of scarcity could exacerbate if not properly managed. Once again, fundamental debates are unfolding on monetary union and the issuing of European credits. The report concludes that more systemic resilience and societal risk hedging will be needed to cope with the pandemic and with future ones. The current crisis reveals that failing to prepare for future pandemics could prove catastrophic. This requires a degree of rethinking about how we collectively define national security, because the damage an pandemic can potentially inflict are not so dissimilar to the impact of war or civil strife. Government will accordingly need to invest in infrastructure, institutions, personnel, equipment, training, procedures, contingency planning, and thoroughly articulating international procedures to coordinate collective action. On the economic front, more planning and financial set-asides are needed so that support for citizens and commercial operators can be assured during the lockdown phases of pandemics. Clear and credible strategies will be needed to ensure that markets and citizens remain liquid. Governments need longer-term exit strategies to eventually unwind debt burdens that will mount as these crises unfold. These strategies will be painful and politically difficult to implement, but they will also be essential for long-term recovery. Policy coordination is essential, particularly among countries with close financial and trade links. This coordination needs to address a range of monetary and fiscal measures. It will also be essential to preserve an open trading order. Collective international responses should also aim to defend the global trade and financial systems. Both the G7 and the G20 will need to provide critical political and diplomatic support for these efforts and can help ensure that key global players are on board. Close cooperation between the US Fed and the European Central Bank, along with allied central banks from countries like Canada and Norway, can help ensure that allied financial systems remain liquid and functioning. Developing countries are being struck very hard by the current crisis. New multilateral lending and aid programs can help place some vulnerable countries on a trajectory for recovery and growth. Failure on this front poses a global economic and security risk. Innovative partnerships among governments, scientists, and economists must be forged to better prepare societies for catastrophic risks. Risk management also demands new kinds of conversation between government and the private sector. We should recognize that preparing for one set of risks can help societies cope with unanticipated ones. Efforts are also needed to protect strategic industries from purchasing from China or other rival countries. Not only should governments worry about China's controlling core 5G technologies, but they should also be mindful of where critical medical technologies are manufactured and ensure that there is no over-reliance on any single supplier country, particularly if that country is considered a strategic rival. Finally, although there will be understandably temptations to engage in a massive defense spending cuts to reallocate funds for social purposes, doing so would highly risky and naive. NATO member governments and parliaments should accordingly rededicate themselves to preserving the 2% of GDP defense spending commitments to which all NATO governments have signed up. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Christian, for your report. I have maybe questions for you also. In the government responses, it was very important how the government react for this COVID-19, how quickly and with which method. And we see it was dependent how many injured people was in the hospitals and how the people quickly prepared. When we was in February in the Brussels, the Estonian embassy prepared a special demonstration how the politicians need to take decision, how quickly and correct or not correct. Yeah, and this is like before the COVID, it was very good for us. Maybe we need to continue this. And maybe we need also to put more information between paragraph 47, 49 about the government responses, maybe with some good examples, how the government react very well, the best countries in Europe, and at least, or maybe one or two examples how the government did react well. Maybe. What is your opinion? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, briefly before the reply, it seems as though we had a minor technical glitch with the platform before finishing with the last report. As we know with these online settings, this happens sometimes. Mr. Philippe Folio from France would like to ask a question related to the BRI. After that on my list, sir, I have Representative Neil Dunn from Florida, United States, who would like to ask a question. Thank you.
Please, Philippe.
Merci.
Thank you, Chairman, dear Evans, dear Christian. Thank you so much. I think that there was a technical glitch, and I indeed wanted to ask a question about the BRI initiative, and I wanted to ask a question about the satellites. Don't you fear that the BRI creates an opportunity for the Chinese for them to accelerate their satellite cover and for them to use the links that they could establish with various nations and to go beyond the ETAR measures, for example, that were implemented by the US in the past in order to hinder the situation. And I actually believe that this was, I think, explained by Jean-Marie Bockel, our colleague, in a report that was submitted about 3 years ago. And I think that it would be useful to talk and consider this aspect, because I think that in terms of the relationship between China and a number of nations within the framework of this BRI, this space aspect really is essential to consider. And I think it's also useful to consider the issues of satellites that are sold by China to other nations. So that's the first thing. Second thing, to come back to the second report. it's not so much about the consequences, but it's about the effect that the COVID-19 crisis is similar to the first bacteriological chemical warfare of the 21st century. And obviously we struggle to be prepared for this. But it's also useful to note that from the start, there were doubts from the Chinese authorities about the nature of the information that was communicated and about the truthfulness of the statistics that were published as regards the number of people who were infected, the number of people who died, and perhaps this delayed our awareness of the crisis itself. So what do you think about these considerations about the fact that the statistics provided by the Chinese authorities weren't exactly accurate at the very beginning? Thank you.
Please, Christian.
I must excuse myself for the last, the last speaker and the first part of his question or comments.
Christian, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you please put your microphone in front of your mouth? It might be difficult.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I just had to excuse myself. I didn't know where the language translator was, so I took a little time to find it. So so maybe if you just could repeat the 3 minutes of your comments, or maybe make it shorter, or if Paul could translate it for me, I don't know. But anyway, I can. So if you want to do that, I got the last part of your question, but still, I would think it's important to get the first part of your question also. So I'm sorry for that. I don't know what to do right now. I can answer Evan's question first, and then I can wait, or whatever. Chairman, you decide.
If you have something you can to tell, if no, maybe we then will be to ask more if Philippe can to send us some message in writing, maybe in French. Thank you.
Perhaps we could answer the chairman's question, and then if Mr. Folio could request the floor again, we could maybe have a very quick recap of his question, and then we could move to Mr. Dunn. Would that work?
Yeah. Neil Dunn, please.
I'll bring up Mr. Dunn then, unless you have an answer right away, Christian.
I can answer Evan's question if you like, because it's going to be too many questions at the same time. So if I just answer his question, you were talking about the risk assessment between different governments, and it's a typical or a good example of where European nations or globally maybe that you're trying to cooperate closer and do trade and so on. But the first countries we're thinking about when this pandemic broke out is actually to close its borders. And it was I did talk about in the government in Norway and saying that it's a kind of a we're talking about open borders, and we're talking about welcoming people and internationally working trade and so on. And suddenly when this happens, we all close our borders. That's the first thing we do. But it makes sense, and it's probably the smart thing to do. But if you're going to solve this, you need to have open borders because it's we need the same solution for all our nations globally. We cannot find our own solution in our own countries. We need to share this, and it cannot be limited to property, to intellectual property. This has to be something that has to be globally provided when it actually is possible to cure or stop this pandemic. So, and also with the decision making that Evans was talking about, we had a discussion in Norway about that, because actually this when we actually stated this pandemic and the first closing of our economy started, was that not actually a government decision. It was a good decision by our health officials in our directorate made that decision because they had the most knowledge about this and they knew the effect that it could have. And it was first the day two that the government actually was introduced to making this decision or accepting this decision. And that it makes also a discussion here in Norway that we were talking about the constitution and how actually we could close down the society without having a government government decision on it, because you needed to have it done quickly. So we didn't have time for the government to actually to do this the decision officially, and it's a big discussion. So for the future, pandemic happens very rarely, happily. So it's but we need to have clear instructions on how we're going to do it as a government, and also as directorates and ministries. We need to have this very clear, and we'll work on that in Norway at least. So, but it has to be solved internationally, and we need to have, and also that's a dilemma being a democratic country, and you see that also in the United States, so you have all different states having different decision-making systems, meaning that one state is doing something, another state is doing another thing, and you can travel from one state to the other, meaning that it's very difficult to control it. And also, when you don't have the same power by government in Western nations, in democratic nations, as you do in nations that is that is more done by authoritarian governments who can decide for the whole nation immediately. It's a dilemma for Western nations. You will have proponents saying that you cannot do this and you cannot do that. But in a country like China, you will say, well, we'll do this way, and we decide. In the Wuhan province, for example, 50 million people or 10 million people, 50 million people, they just closed the whole city down. I mean, if you do that, you cannot do that in a democratic country. It would not work. And so they have an advantage there for us. And so it's easier to stop it there, even though it's not even stopped there now. But anyway, they stopped it temporarily, at least.
Thank you, Christian. Ethan, we can give the floor to Mr. Folliot.
Mr. Folliot has just sent in some
ready.
very quick precisions on his questions about the space domain of the BRI, I believe.
Voilà. Écoutez, de manière...
Right. So perhaps I will send my questions by writing. I just wanted to have your thoughts about the space dimension in the BRI initiative. And I wanted to refer you to the report that Jean-Marie Bockel provided us with a few years ago, because the space aspect is very important on a strategic level. A lot of things are going to be played out in space, and China, beyond its maritime and land positioning, is not neglecting the space aspect, and that was the core of my question. But I think that you sort of answered my second question. That question was about the problem of the beginning of the crisis, the pandemic in China, and the issue of the statistics that had been provided by China. Thank you.
Christian, the floor is you, please.
Thank you. Very sure. It's a good thing that you're actually sending in a written question. I mean, that you can go in detail to this question in more properly. But of course, it's China is developing the same way as European nations do militarily. And of course, today, everything above ground is more important than it was 10, 15, 50 years ago. Obviously, and it goes faster, and it's difficult to actually to see it and acknowledge that it's there. You have surveillance. You have actually people being looked at all over the world. The data links that we are developing for peaceful purposes in the Western world is using also to do the opposite side in some countries, and China is one of them. So if we are actually being a part of this development, you cannot stop it, and China cannot stop it. So you either have to find ways of dealing with it with China and trying to stop it. I don't think it's possible. You cannot stop the world and saying you want to go off. You get off. You have to be a part of this world, and China is doing this no matter what we say, and we can try to exclude them. I know that the United States is doing it for now, and it's probably a good decision now, but I don't know how it's going to be 5-10 years down the road. So it's that's my view on it. And again, send in a written question, and we know that every question we get, we will expand on that in the next report. So it's so it's so everybody's being pleased is pleased when we get the second draft. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. So we return back to Neil Dunn. Neil, the floor is yours, please.
I'm on?
Yes, you can try to
Yes, sir, you're on.
Okay, very good. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to associate myself with the comments made in the report about the economic fallout of the pandemic and also of the thoughtful comments of the gentleman from France about space and the underreporting or the errant reporting of the pandemic.
Excuse me, Neil. Please don't move your microphone. Keep one position. Yes, and more closer to your mouth.
Okay. I would like to say a comment. China is largely an economic rational actor, meaning the best way to change their malignant practices as a whole is through an economic response. We, all of us, need a collective strategy to ensure NATO countries provide rational alternative investment and investor options, both to developing nations and to each other. If the nations don't want to do business with China, and many don't, it behooves us to make sure that those nations have an attractive alternative to China and can do business with some of us instead. Well, we need a plan to encourage trade and business relationships with and among the NATO countries rather than with China. And let me end by saying the world is going to emerge from the coronavirus crisis looking much different than it does today. I think the violent economic dislocations have mostly already occurred. Now is the least painful time and the most productive time for us to tell our markets what behaviors we're going to encourage and what behaviors we're going to allow. I think we need to be diligent and active in countering China's economic hegemony. There's no nation represented on this call whose future security and prosperity would not benefit from much closer manufacturing, service, commodities, and trade relationships, as well as security relationships amongst ourselves. We're already a close group of allies. We should be taking advantage of this. And I submit to you, this is a pivotal moment for us to respond to that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Neil. Christian, did you hear? Good?
I heard some of it, but I guess it was more of a comment than also more than a question. And then I very much understand what you're saying. And the economic fallouts, it's being discussed in the report, but I did not. We did not talk so much about it now. But I think it's what was a cooperation between nations and companies that the trade was doing beneficial for all parts and all parties. That's why we have trade, because you can do it more properly and everybody's it's growing and we're all getting a little more prosperous every day. And it's very quick that when you have these problems that we all get more internal looking and we're all trying to save our own companies, thinking about not about the dependency that we are on other nations because we are afraid of different reasons. I see in my own country that when you have closed borders, you're looking at the vacation times. You always have vacations in Norway, and the prices on on houses actually going up, and the same with the cabins in Norway. They're increasing. And what does that mean 10 years down the road if you buy your own cabins in Norway? I mean, maybe you'll continue doing that, and that means less travel. And you see the airlines having difficulties surviving, and it's and the tourism industry. This is the consequences of this, and hopefully that we need to open up. As we were just 5 years ago, 3 years ago, we need to continue having open up at least the western part of the world, that we actually are being able to stay friends and I think to be visited each other and talk to each other, not just by Skype, but actually see each other, will actually make our better understanding between nations. So I'm a little, I see the, because you are also supported by the green movement in this, meaning that they are supporting us not to move at all. even though they would like us to stay friends, they're saying that you should not travel and you should not even trade. You should save your own economy, and that's their. So this pandemic is actually being helping, at least in Norway, the green side of the politicians, and it's good for them. But if you want to have the cooperation and think that you are actually working on getting a higher standard of living by trade, and if you think that's a goal, not in itself, but it makes you more comfortable, you need to have that. But if you have a green, I'm not criticizing the green, I'm just saying that they are arguing this way, and they're saying that, well, that's not a target for us or a goal for us to have actually more economic growth. We would like to have slow it down. So we have this very hard ways of dealing with trade and businesses now in this pandemic 19, and what's going to happen next, I don't know. But as nations, for NATO, we are looking at the strategic issues, what it means for us militarily and what it means for our values and the why we are 30 nations representing the same values and defending the same values. What does that mean? And so in that sense, it's more question to ask than to be answered here. So, but again, everything that you ask, I say it again, will be better explained and better worked out in the next version of this report, and that's why we have this session. So in Athens, if you can travel to Athens, then I don't know, we'll be put out the final report, and hopefully we will have all those issues being explained better, even though we don't have any answers even then. But at least we will actually try to work on these questions and to talk a little bit more about these issues. But again, I think it's a very good comment from the United States here, because this is very important for businesses. Without businesses, international trade, it's well, you know what's going to happen. More poor people are actually trying to move from the south to the north, meaning that the immigration is going to increase and the pressure on the border is going to increase, and the poverty in Africa and other places is going to increase, meaning that it's going to be very, very, very hard to actually make this worse unless you open up and start trading again as soon as possible.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Neil. But in page number 12, in paragraph 55, there's some figures about the trade between the European Union and United States in 2018. And it was 1.3 trillion United States dollars. It's, 22.4%. Maybe not so bad, but we can do at least keep or maybe do these figures more better. Thank you. But I don't have any persons on the list. Maybe Ethan, Paul, maybe you have some names, no?
Mr. Chairman, I do not have any requests for the floor at this time.
Yes, please, Ethan.
We have no requests, sir.
No request. So if we don't have request, we can say thank you very much, Christian, for your excellent jobs during these two reports. We will be fulfill this report until they attend our autumn sessions. And say thank you very much, Christian, for your report.
Thank you. Nice seeing you all.
Yeah.
For some of you at least. Okay, thank you.
So thank you everybody for the participation in this virtual meeting, our committee. But finally, I want to ask, is it Congressman Davis, is it present today with us or no? No. Okay, but I want to announce just she's retired from our assembly. Thank you very much for his help. Thank you, just was together with us. Maybe we'll be returning back, we know. Thank you very much for the all staff. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, the all interpreter for translations. Also, thank you, Michael Sinkwalder, who also helped us to writing the summary, and Joe Reichen, who are computer specialist and give for us this opportunity to stay together with any problems. Thank you. I think I can to close officially this our committee meeting, and see you in September. in the second two reports, but Paul Cook, our director, wants to say something. Paul?
I just wanted to add a thank you to Anne-Laure Bleuse, who's our coordinator. She was on the controls today off the screen, but she made everybody able to talk to each other. So
Thank you. Maybe all assembly and staff also who are helping for us. Thank you very much. And the meeting is closed. Thank you.